Hello and welcome to BBC News. America is to stop its large contribution to a UN agency which supports Palestinian refugees, saying it's irredeemably flawed. The State Department said Washington will hold talks with the UN and others to consider new approaches to conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians. I asked our Washington correspondent Chris Buckler what prompted this move.
Well, I think there are several different things here. First of all, America feels that it has been funding this programme, has been leading certainly in terms of funding this programme for a number of years, and that it doesn't want to carry that financial burden anymore. But that's only the part of it, because it also makes very clear in its statement that it has concerns about the way the programme is being run. It says, for example, that it's been in crisis mode for many years, that it's an irredeemably flawed operation, and it really attacks the whole agency in terms of the way it is providing aid and education. That, of course, is something that the agency itself really rejects. But I think there's a third element to this as well, and that's a political one, because I think there is a political edge to this decision. And that's because relationships between Washington and the Palestinian leadership are not good, particularly since Donald Trump's decision to move the US Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. They have been at a low point, and there have been a number of fights inside the United Nations. And as a result, I think there will be some who will be saying that there is a political element to this, and therefore, given the amount of good that this agency does do, there will be many who will be saying, is this the right decision?
Well, Chris, this has been in the offing because they did mention this earlier this year that they were going to do this.
Yeah, and we do have a statement from UNRWA, which is this organisation, in which they say they have deep regret and disappointment, but what they do not say is that there is surprise at this. But they do strike back at some of the comments that have been made, particularly that one that it says that they were irredeemably flawed in the way they're providing some of the programmes. They point out that the World Bank has described their activities as a global public good. And of course, they also want to continue with their work. But there's potentially a big hole in their funding because the United States really offered more than $360 million last year to this organisation. This year, it has given $60 million, so that's $300 million of a hole. And of course, going forward, it doesn't plan to contribute anything at all.
This is BBC News, and this is our top story. The Trump administration is stopping all funding for the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees. Well, let's get a little bit more on this story because a little earlier I spoke with Omar Badar. He's the Deputy Director of the Arab American Institute, and he gave his reaction to the halting of all that funding.
I mean, it's really appalling. It's hard to find the right words to describe it. I mean, he's effectively going after some of the most vulnerable populations around in the region. It's morally reprehensible because of the direct impact it has on these refugees. It is politically stupid because it gets us farther away from peace. And it's also potentially destabilizing because we don't know what the consequences of that are going to be, of denying millions of people the vital assistance they need. So just it's really negative and from every angle that you can possibly look at it.
But this hasn't come out of the blue. They did say that they were going to do this possibly earlier this year, so that should have given UNRWA at least some time to prepare.
Yeah, although it's very difficult to know what preparing is. I mean, it's a question of whether other countries, how much other countries are going to be able to step up to fill in the gap that the U.S. is leaving behind. But let's remember that this is ultimately about, from the Trump administration, the hints they've given early on, it's about pressuring the Palestinian leadership to play ball and to acquiesce to American policy in the region, with the Jerusalem embassy move and pressuring them to come to come to the peace negotiations under very, very, difficult circumstances. Let's just call it that. And
sorry to interrupt, Omar, but I mean, you're saying acquiesce, but they would say that they want the Palestinian administration to come to the negotiating table and talk peace. For example, Hamas refuses to recognize Israel, and they need to do more for their people, do more for the Palestinian people instead of relying on UNRWA.
Yeah, but let's be clear about one thing, is that Israel is the one that created that refugee crisis in the first place by driving these Palestinians out. And the problem has long been the Palestinians have been bending over backwards to try to resolve this conflict on the basis of a two-state solution, which Israel has rejected repeatedly by building more and more Israeli settlements on top of Palestinian lands. The problem has always been a lack of American pressure on Israel to get it to abide by international law and to end the occupation of the Palestinian territories for peace to move forward. And when the Trump administration came in, instead of applying that needed pressure on Israel to get the peace process moving, what they ended up doing is giving Israel a carte blanche to do whatever it wants and shifted all of the pressure on the Palestinians, which basically is moving us in the wrong direction in a sense. So coming to a negotiation table under these circumstances, there's basically no reason to come to a negotiation table when the party that is supposed to be mediating these talks ends up effectively acting like a participant in Israel's war on the Palestinians.
If we look at this from purely the perspective of what the United States it is, which is that this agency has been running since, 1950? We're about, 68 years on. That is too long for an agency to be running a program looking after refugees.
That is probably the only thing that the Trump administration and I would agree on. The fact that you have a population that has been left as refugees for this long is absolutely unacceptable. And frankly, it is unsustainable in the long term to keep basically trying to look after refugees, a population that is growing. But the way to solve that is not by crushing the victims. It's not by punishing the victims by withholding aid from them. It's by pressuring the party that created this crisis in the first place, which is the Israeli government, to take responsibility for having created that crisis and to make them more interested in resolving this conflict in a way that actually takes care of the refugees, as opposed to putting the pressure on the victims in this situation.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that what UNRWA does is it makes Palestinians dependent on aid, dependent on being given money, rather than using their own nows to build up the economy and make things happen for themselves.
No, it's very easy for somebody who's trying to basically get away with having what Netanyahu is trying to do is evade the responsibility that the Israeli government has towards these refugees by basically saying that those who are trying to sustain their life are somehow responsible for perpetuating the refugee crisis, when again, you cannot end the refugee crisis by withholding aid from people. The only way to do it is by resolving the issue politically. And that's really the only place that this conversation can take place. It's about who is being rejectionist when it comes to moving the peace process forward. And that's where the conversation ought to be happening.
And now speaking there to Omar Badar of the Arab American Institute.